input is going to come dorsal, from the dorsal root to the dorsal root ganglion. What's going to be in the dorsal root ganglion? All the cell bodies of those sensory nerves, and they'll come into the backside of the spinal cord. So are the ventral root and dorsal root one-way or two-way roads? One-way roads. When does it combine to become a two-way road? At the spinal nerve trunk. Then we have a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. Where's the dorsal? Which one goes to more musculature? The ventral one goes to more musculature. That dorsal ramus just goes to the stuff that is used to kind of keep your back nice and good posture. Everything else in your body goes through that ventral ramus. That's why look how small that dorsal ramus is compared to the ventral ramus. There's a lot less musculature in the back per se. There's still a great amount, but a lot less comparatively. So there's less neurons traveling through that branch. Okay, and these are both, are they two-way or one-way roads? Two-way. Both the dorsal and ventral rami have motor output, leaving out, and input, afferent sensory fibers, heading in. Questions about that stuff thus far? Okay, so where are the two levels of the spinal cord where we see variation? So generally, we're always going to see the roots, the rami, and a gray communicating ramus. But in certain areas, we see a white communicating ramus, and in certain areas, we see a parasympathetic splanchnic nerve. Where do we see the white communicating ramus? T1 to L2 only. Have that memorized for this, and if you take advanced anatomy. That's something you need to know. Now, something that's interesting, people ask, what's the difference between the white communicating ramus and the gray communicating ramus? So when we're talking about the nervous system, what is white and what is gray? Does anybody remember or happen to know? Myelinated means white. Unmyelinated means gray. So the only type of neurons that are going to go through the gray communicating ramus, will they be myelinated or non-myelinated? Non-myelinated. The only non-myelinated neurons for this class are post-ganglionic neurons. For those that have the afternoon lecture, this will make more sense as you go through it. So the only thing that's going to be heading out of the sympathetic trunk into the ventral ramus is going to be post-ganglionic neurons. If I have a sensory afferent neuron, a preganglionic motor neuron, those are both myelinated. Thus, in order to go in and out of the sympathetic trunk, what type of ramus must they use? The white communicating ramus. So in other words, like we see this trace here, we have this neuron on the right. It's an afferent neuron, and it has to go up and go through a white communicating ramus. It can't go down through here because the afferent sensory neuron is always myelinated. Thus, it must always go through a white communicating ramus, and that's what we see. Now, Mark's going to go more into depth on that in lecture, and I will drill it in SI sessions. Questions thus far?
Is it neuron or nerve?
Neuron. So that's a great question that I have in my question bank. What is the difference between a neuron and a nerve? A nerve is a bundle of neurons wrapped in what type of tissue? Connective tissue. You've got the endoneurium, the perineurium, the epineurium, and of course, at the very cellular level, they're also myelinated, or sometimes, with the instance of the postganglionic neurons, they're unmyelinated. Good question. Other questions? So the white communicating ramus is what levels? T1 to L2. And then what levels are we going to see? What's this nerve called that comes off the ventral ramus and heads towards the body cavity? If it's going towards the body cavity, what's the word we think of? Splanchnic. Any nerve that comes to the body cavity, so this one off the sympathetic trunk towards the body cavity, this one off the ventral ramus towards the body cavity, somewhere in its name will be the word splanchnic. This one is heading off the ventral ramus to the muscle of the organ. So what will it be, sympathetic or parasympathetic? Parasympathetic. Remember we learned at the end of yesterday's lecture, parasympathetic always goes to what type of smooth muscle? Of the gut tube, which is both, the gut tube, it's kind of weird. You think it's just digestive system, the gut tube is the digestive and the respiratory system. Embryologically, they both sprout off the same endoderm. So again, parasympathetic always goes to the smooth muscle of the gut tube, whether that's respiratory system or digestive system. And the sympathetic system, nerves always go to what? Smooth muscle of the cardiovascular system. So blood vessels, in order to tone them, to cause them to dilate, to cause them to constrict, that's sympathetic control. I mean, you have a few, like he says, there are a few exceptions. For instance, the eye. There are muscles in the eye with sympathetic control. They get dilated. Your eyes get big when you get excited. And parasympathetic control, they get constricted. But in general, sympathetic cardiovascular smooth muscle, parasympathetic gut tube smooth muscle. So again, what is the title of this nerve going to be? Parasympathetic splanchnic nerve. And again, I call it a nerve because this is going to be a bundle of nerves. But when we're doing a trace, it's just a neuron. That's the differentiation, because just one neuron is going to carry the signal. But the thing is titled, the structure is a nerve. So this gets back down to that kind of structure tissue thing. Again, when I do a trace, I'm tracing through specific neurons that are in a nerve. And a nerve is this whole structure of a bunch of neurons wrapped in connective tissue. What other questions do you have? Okay, so again, what's this structure called that runs up and down both sides of the vertebral column, but outside the bone? That's going to be the sympathetic trunk. And those who haven't finished the autonomic nervous system will see its purpose today. And so if I have a nerve that's running off the sympathetic trunk towards the body cavity, what will I call that nerve? It's sympathetic, and it's heading towards the body cavity, so we call it splanchnic nerve. Does it make sense? Yes? So you can think of splanchnic, visceral, and coelomic as very much synonyms. They're a little bit different, but for your purposes, I would think of it as the same. Splanchnic is used for nerves heading into the gut tube area. Visceral refers strictly to your organs, like your viscera. And then coelomic refers to the body cavities. You guys will learn all about coeloms in a couple of lectures. But for your purposes, you can think of coelomic, visceral, and splanchnic as synonyms referring to heading towards the body cavity. All right, that's it for this. Any more questions about this? Again, this is, when we practice traces, this is the type of diagram that will be on your test. And he'll have colored pencils. He'll be like, okay, your pseudo-unipolar afferent sensory neuron should be red, your motor neuron should be green, your preganglionic motor neuron should be yellow, and postganglionic should be purple. Something like that. And we'll practice those in SI again and again.
I have a question.
Yes?
Is there a way we would really know if we had these colored pencils? Because everyone said we would have to on the first test, so I was like really confident I could color anything. And then we didn't have to, and the leader lines confused me more. Because it would just be like, it would word things just kind of different on the bone part. And so, there was, like, I guess I'm just asking if there's a way that we'll know for sure if we can color it.
I can say with 99.9% certainty that a nerve trace will be on your second test. And if that is the case, it requires color to do a nerve trace, because the graders have to differentiate what you want to be your pseudo-unipolar afferent neurons, your preganglionics, your postganglionics, and your just skeletal motor neurons. Those are the four, and interneurons. So you'll be working with 5 different neurons. So every test I've seen and done, he didn't color. It was a surprise to me that he didn't have color on this last test. And I apologize. I think it differs because I hated coloring. I love leader lines. So.
Well, I think it was because he would like, you would say the structure, and then he would like say a weird question about it, and how it was different. I can't quite remember. Just kind of yeah.
I don't know. I didn't write it. I agree that things can